Hello and welcome to the Science Fiction and Fantasy Marketing Podcast, the show where we help you establish your author brand, increase the size of your audience, and sell more books. I'm Lindsay Baroker, and I'm here with both co-hosts this week.
I'm Jeff Fool.
And I'm Joe Lalo.
My third co-host, Cutter, is staring at me and will hopefully go take a nap real soon because we've got a great guest for you this week, Nathan Van Coops. He's going to talk about writing time travel fiction and kind of what it takes to succeed in a smaller niche of sci-fi and fantasy. His intro on Amazon, so his bio on Amazon says he lives in St. Petersburg, Florida on a diet comprised mainly of tacos. He enjoys old planes, motorcycles, and Volkswagens and contends that there is such a thing as dressy flip-flops. I have a pair, I completely understand. He is the author of the time travel adventure series In Times Like These and the Skylighter Adventures. Nathan, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate being here.
Thank you. And why don't you give yourself a better introduction than I did and tell us a little bit about your books?
Well, thank you. Yeah, I've been writing primarily time travel for quite a few years now, and that's kind of the bread and butter of what I do. But I do have a secondary series that's I'm working on now, which is the Skylighter Adventures, which is a little bit more of a steampunk sky pirate adventure. Still in the sci-fi realm, but it's a little bit more YA. So I'm having a lot of fun with that as well.
And did you decide to self-publish early on, or did you think about doing the traditional route or anything first?
When I first started writing, my first book in the In Times Like These series is In Times Like These. And I know you guys have talked about the error of naming your series after your first book. But at the time, I thought I was just writing one book. And then it was around 2008 or so I was working on this initially. And then it sort of stuck with me for a long time. Didn't finally finish it up till around 2012. And then I did do the querying and sent out a lot of letters and tried out various agents. Just because one well-meaning friend of mine, as soon as I published or posted up that I had finished a manuscript, first thing out of their mouth was, "Oh, don't self-publish." At the time, I was like, "Well, okay, I guess that's I guess I shouldn't try that." And but over the course of that year, I did learn a lot about the publishing industry and also the opportunities available in self-publishing and how things had changed, especially since 2011 and the Kindle and how everything had revolutionized itself with print on demand. So I thought, after many rejections of my first novel, I said, well, I think this thing has legs. I think it has a chance to find an audience. And I went ahead and published it myself in 2013. And then I've been putting out a book pretty much about once a year ever since. So I don't write very quickly. And I write big books, so they tended to take me a while. But so pretty much a book a year ever since then.
We should point out that first book has over 1,000 reviews on Amazon and is still selling well 5 years later. So I think your instincts were good that people were interested in it.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun, and it's had a good following. And each story I've written in that series has kind of taken the world a different direction. And even though it is a first-person point of view story with one main character, the world keeps growing every book, and I think people have really enjoyed the time travel experience and some of the rules I've set up in there. It's found its place with the sci-fi fans, because sci-fi fans tend to really like there to be rules and a system in place, especially when you deal with time travel. And one of the things that I did in that very first book was to not make the mistake of just glossing over all the massive issues with time travel. I actually dealt with the fact that the Earth was moving and things like that. And you couldn't just willy-nilly appear in a grassy field in the middle of nowhere and not have grass through your legs. Like there were things that I had seen done in movies like Time Traveler's Wife and things like that always just bugged me. And so I decided to fix that and try to make my own time travel system, and people really responded well to it. And it's been a lot of fun ever since.
Very cool. It seems like from taking a peek on Amazon that a time travel category is a bit like the steampunk category, and that it's not super competitive. You can get in the top 100 with ranking in the tens of thousands. Mm-hmm. Have you found that there are readers in that? I mean, obviously you have found that there are readers eagerly looking for it. Do you think it's been useful to be in a small niche? Like there's not enough books that people, I assume there's not a big selection for those who really are looking for these kind of stories.
It is. I would say time travel is a little bit bigger than steampunk because I'm in steampunk as well with my other series, the Skylight Adventures, and it's a little easier to rank than steampunk. And then there's a little bit of crossover. One of my books, The Chronothon, has some airships, and time travel can kind of cross into the steampunk territory a little bit. So I'm kind of able to make comparisons. So time travel is a little bit bigger than that, but it is definitely a niche of the larger science fiction world. So I definitely think that there's room for readers. There's different types of time travel that people write. One of the very common ones, if anyone has read Replay by Ken Grimwood, that's a kind of a classic where you're headed back to relive your life over again. Jerry Merritt has one called Gift of Time that I read recently that was also very good. That's sort of a common theme. There's, Stephen King has one book in there that you see show up on the top of the time travel charts quite a bit, the 11/22/63. So there's various types of time travel, and then some are just tangentially time travel. So I think if you're writing a book that is definitely has time travel in it, and it's not just sort of loosely affiliated with time travel, you can do better in that genre because there are very dedicated readers. One of the reasons I think I was successful early on was I made some connections with some other time travel readers via Goodreads. When I was after I published my first book and was trying to figure out how to make it sell, I got on Goodreads and joined a time travel group. And because I had been all my life and wanting to read more time travel and didn't know where to find it on the book. It wasn't on the bookshelves in the Barnes and Noble. So I said, well, I'm going to write my own story. And then only after I'd published it and sort of wandered onto Goodreads did I realize, oh, there are tons of time travel books out there. You just have to know where to find them. And there are these readers. There were thousands of people in this Goodreads group, and they were reading a time travel book every month. And I thought, wow, this is amazing. These are my people. So I think it's just a matter of going out and finding those people, and then finding ways to connect with them in, and then not in a salesy way, not to just jump on Goodreads and say, hey, everyone buy my book, because that never works on Goodreads.
Yeah.
But they'll tear you a new one usually. But I found that it was a great way to start making connections and really start learning about the genre. I read a ton. I joined the book club and started reading every month. And I think that was a key to some of my early success.
Excellent. Yeah, like, as you say, the worst thing you could possibly do when you're trying to make connections is just to show up with your hand out and a book in your hand. Buy my book.
Right.
All right. So you touched on this a little bit a minute ago, but time travel is the kind of thing that, like romance, like mystery, it can be the genre, or it can be just a trope that occurs commonly in a genre. Sci-fi is any sci-fi series that goes on long enough is probably going to have a time travel entry. I've got a time travel book in my sci-fi series.
Right.
So, obviously, a standalone book that hinges upon time travel belongs in the time travel genre. But when you've got a mid-series book that hinges heavily on time travel, but the rest of the series does not, should you sort of push that to time travel readers, or should it just be a full series thing if you're going to go aim for the time travel subgenre?
That's a good question. I think there is an opportunity. I would say most time travel readers are enjoyers of other types of sci-fi as well. Because like Lindsay was saying, it is a relatively small niche. I don't know how many people. I've surveyed my own lists and things, and they're voracious readers, most of them. And they're reading all kinds of genres. They're not just reading time travel. A lot of them are reading paranormal. And I was surprised at how many different genres they're consuming. But it is different because there are many things, especially time travel romance, which is its own sort of subcategory.
Yeah.
It typically uses time travel simply as a vehicle. So usually time travel occurs in the very beginning of the story, and then you spend the entire story somewhere else in some other time period. And then at the very end, you come back. And that wasn't what I wanted to write. I wanted to write a world where time travel is a daily occurrence, just kind of like with Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling doesn't just use magic to do big things. She also has them doing the dishes and making jokes, and magic is an integral part of their daily life. And that was what I was looking to do, was create a world where there are tons of time travelers. It's not just one time traveler. not just going to one time period. But I was trying to come up with a system where, okay, what if time travel was part of your daily life? What if there was a whole world of this? What would that be like? So I think that's one of the reasons why people have really liked my series, is because it's not just a there and back again. So I think you have to be careful about how you label your book, and just as long as your description, I think, is accurate, and as long as you're somewhere in the science. Well, I mean, you can even have fantasy time travel, so it doesn't necessarily have to just be sci-fi. But people can be a little harsh. I think the science fiction readers, especially the ones who are more hard science fiction based, like the rules, and if you're just going to wave your hand and say it's magic and that's all there is, then you may not get all of those readers.
Which kind of ties into my question here. You touched on it briefly, that your time traveling kind of stems on, you think about it. Obviously you can't use the time machine method, which just, a guy activates the machine, he sees everything around him, either, get old, get young, whatever, whatnot. So my question to you is how much do you try to explain the whole time travel jump in years? I mean, do you actually have it figured out in your own head, or you just go for the option to say, okay, well, here's the machine, you hop in it, it takes you backwards in time, or here's a portal, it jumps you backwards in time, and that's it, and just let the reader try to figure it out? Or how do you handle that?
So that was one of the things that, like I said, used to bug me, is that, people would just push a button, have this sort of push button time travel experience where, okay, I'm going to push this button and the machine's going to go back in time. And it never made any sense to me, because the Earth is moving thousands of miles an hour through space. If you were to travel from where you're sitting right now to where you're sitting, 3 days from now, you'll be in outer space, because, the Earth moved and now you're floating out there. So I had to come up with a system, which I called anchor-based time travel, which basically you had to time travel in conjunction with something that's not time traveling. That could be a table or a chair or something that I essentially, for my gimmick in my stories, I created a particle, that anything that had this particle in it can time travel, anything that didn't can't. So it was fairly simple, and then you activated these particular particles via a watch, just a chronometer that the time travelers wear. And there's a few different types of time travel devices. But I also employ a few other tricks, like time gates, things like that, more of like a Stargate type of situation. There's a variety of different tools out there that people use, and I think my world, I kind of combined a few. But the anchor-based time travel was a great way for me to play with space as well as time, because let's say, for example, you were sitting in your chair right now and you time travel to 3 days from now, but someone comes and moves your chair. Now you end up where your chair will be. If your chair was your anchor, that can be either really good, like, for example, you might be able to touch the side of a plane and end up where the plane is, go from New York to LA and just instantly, but if you end up, somewhere you don't want to be, someone throws your chair in the ocean, guess what? Now you're in the ocean.
That can have a lot of comedic value there, now that I think about it.
There's a lot of comedic value. There's a lot of ways to die too. I was very clear when I started out with all these rules that there were many terrible ends for time travelers. So I think that's, people have responded well to that, because I think the other people will go along for the ride if your method is more hand wavy, if it's more just the time machine method. As long as the story is good, I don't think people are going to give you too hard of a time. But you will miss out on some of those readers who really enjoy imagining this was possible. I get some people who read my series and they'll write reviews like, if time travel was ever possible, this is how it would actually work. And I'm always flattered by that. That's what I was going for when I first started writing this, just because that's what I really wanted to put into a story.
For those people who may be writing one or thinking of writing a time travel adventure, have you found that there are any time periods that if you go back to, like, readers are maybe really interested in it, but if you pick other time periods, they're less interested in it? I don't know. I had this experience. You mentioned the time travel romance. I did one with the pen name, and I had them go to a dystopian future. And every other, like, the top 100 was all like back to Vikings or Highlanders, and mine only is basically sold to, like, my diehard fans that had read the other stuff. And looking back, I think at least for the romance, maybe they're a little fussier about the time periods. They want those hunky Highlanders and
it is that seems to be a sort of trope of the time travel romance genre. It's usually a heroine from present day ends up with hunky Highlander, or some sort of Viking, like you said. there's usually some man chest involved, on those types of books. But that is, again, sort of a there and back again tale, or it's Outlander essentially. And that is a very strong genre. So if you want to write in that genre, it's definitely popular. And I think understanding those tropes is important. But not to say that you can't open those doors and try new things and send people to the future. I think the future is very fun to write. I think there's a lot of different versions of time travel out there too. So some people do a linear time travel where nothing really changes if you go to the past. So you have to kind of figure out those rules in advance when you're writing. Are you going to make a linear time where if you went back in time, you were always there and you haven't really been able to affect anything? Or are you going to make a multiverse where if you go back in time and now all of a sudden you're in a parallel timeline and now nothing you do really affects timeline A? Those are some of the things you have to think about when you're starting out writing time travel and kind of iron out those rules. And it pays to read heavily in the genre to understand what those rules are so that you don't mix and match or kind of confuse things for your reader.
It does sound like maybe avoiding the romance category. By doing so, your readers may be a little less, maybe open to more different things, different time periods, just the straight sci-fi readers. And I think your blurb does mention that you do have romance, but maybe you weren't going for that particular category on Amazon.
Right. It's very minimal. I've found that the majority of my readers, the sci-fi readers, don't want much romance in their books. They prefer, no sex. They prefer, mostly it's okay that it's there, but I get some reviews that'll say, yeah, there's a romance, but it was okay because it was light. It's just barely there. And that seems to be the trend anyway. And having learned from those reviews, that's what I intend to do with my stories. You want to give them some heart and some personality, obviously, and some character development, but no really on-screen love scenes, things like that, at least for my readers. As far as time periods, I know you asked about different time periods. Other than time travel romance, I think people really love the past. Obviously, they're big on just seeing different cultures. My second book is called The Chronothon, and it's a time travel adventure race where basically each level of the race is a different time period. So they're going through a bunch of different ones, and some people loved the fact that I went and saw pirates but it's interesting because different people had different favorite chapters or different scenes of that book because they fixated on a particular time period. They said, oh, I loved ancient Egypt, or I loved, I said, I love the pirates. Oh, and I love that you did the Hindenburg. So people, it's hard to pin that down, but with time travel, you have so many options. You can really play around with it. You don't have to stick to any one time period.
Now, you talked about this a little bit earlier, there's 1,000 different ways that you can do time travel, and there's 1,000 different ways that you can interpret the consequences of time travel. Mm-hmm. And particularly when you get into sci-fi audiences, and particularly when you get into hard sci-fi audiences, there's the tendency for a lot of audiences to decide, this is the way it is, and if you didn't write that way, then you're wrong. Do you find yourself running into people who are just like, I really want to like the story, but that's not how time travel works?
Not too much. I think it's one of those things that as long as you set up the rules and you abide by your own rules, then you're okay. It's Interstellar is a good example of this, where it's a great movie. It doesn't necessarily obey all the laws of physics, but it obeys all of its own internal rules. They basically sort of tell their own rules as you're getting set up in the movie, what's going to happen, how people are going to age differently because of the gravity and such. And they abide by those particular rules. And so you're satisfied at the end of the film, even if you're a physics major, you might be able to say, okay, well, this particular part they were fudging, but it made sense to the characters. And the characters weren't all of a sudden doing something that was impossible in their own world. I think as long as you do that, then you're pretty safe, because there's always going to be a leap of faith. In my books, for example, I don't talk about them displacing air when they jump. Right. And some people will be like, oh, well, you didn't account for the air.
Air doesn't count.
It's like, some people really get into that detail. And they're like, yeah, there's a pop when someone shows up because you're displacing all this air and you've moved it. Or I had one review that was like, yeah, well, you didn't account for bugs. And I'm like, yeah, I did. I thought about it, but I just didn't really want to get to that granular level. And
Everyone knows that the best science takes place in a frictionless vacuum. That's what we all learned about in physics class. And I guess one other thing, sort of on the same topic, is it's like there's a lot of really great ways that have been used in the past to sort of dramatically depict time travel. Like Back to the Future has got newspapers changing, and there's the inevitable meeting your past self. And like, how many of those do you throw in, and how many of those do you not throw in that people miss?
Yeah. It's a lot of fun to play with those tropes, because I think people do have some expectation that there will be a twist in your story. If you're writing time travel, there needs to be some sort of time loop involved. If you spend all your time telling a story, it can be a wonderful story, but if the plot doesn't hinge on time travel, then that was kind of the hook that got people in the first place. So you just have to be careful with your expectations. If your whole hook is just the time period, for example, if you read Time and Again by Jack Finney, like, he just has gorgeous detail. Like, it's a classic book, but people read the book because they want to feel like they're in the time period. And he's beautiful with his settings, and he's just immersing you in another world, in another time specifically, and that's why you read that book. And people love it. But other people, like, if you're more into the plot, and for me, for example, I like more time travel, action, adventure. And I'm always thinking, well, yeah, but you can time travel. So I could solve all these other problems with this time travel ability that you're not doing. All you're doing is going around and, admiring the New York City skyline, which is great, but you can time travel. So it's, I think it's just important to understand your genre. Like I said, I specifically say that it's a time travel adventure. So I'm writing an adventure story, which I'm going to make sure that there's danger and make sure that there's a time travel twist that people didn't see coming.
Now you mentioned it, that a lot of people like to read it about the time travel stories because they like to see like what happens if you tinker in the past, what changes in the future, and obviously, do you include elements like that in your books there?
As far as changing the past or changing the future?
Whether inadvertent or whether willingly, I mean, have you written about stuff like that? Because I personally have a fantasy / Western, Old West type of theme there, and I deliberately, I knew I was going to do it. I deliberately screwed with the past, and I found myself having to do a lot of explaining just to make sure that that your readers would actually be able to follow along. I was wondering if you did something similar.
I do. What I did for my world is that instead of it being a linear time travel, I have a multiverse. In addition to being a multiverse, it's a fractal multiverse. So basically, I've come up with the idea that time is a fractal, so that it could be broken at any given point. In any moment, you could go back in time and create a new timeline. So there are a variety of different time streams, and then there's actually a government that sort of controls certain streams unless people go certain places. There are a lot of rules, but so what that allows is that people can go back in time, change something on purpose, and then start timeline B or C or whatever it is they're on. Which then, of course, you've left timeline A, so that now you're missing from timeline A, and now there's two of you over in timeline B, which allows you to do things like meet yourself and have conversations with your past self or your future self, and it's a lot of fun, and it still abides by the rules. But you couldn't do that if your rules that you set up earlier on were, okay, this is a linear and nothing changes. Obviously, you have to set your world up in a way that makes sense. But I have a lot of fun. I've got one of my books, like the third book in my series, there's 4 different versions of the main character running around. So 2 of them are dead, technically. It's like it's a lot of fun.
And you didn't have any readers saying this is too hard to follow along with? I mean, they're just like reading it and having a good time?
For the most part. Some people will get a little confused, but there's different types of readers. Some will just go back and reread the paragraph over again and say, I want to make sure I absolutely get this right. So for those people, I make sure that those rules work, that if they do take the effort to go back and really focus on this and concentrate, that they will get it. Alternatively, some people are just like, time travel-y stuff, keep reading. And then they just enjoy this story. So I try not to bog down too much with that. My most recent book, my 4th novel in the series, I actually wrote an explanation. There's a really fairly complex twist in like chapters 23 and 24. And then I put a little note down the bottom, like, by the way, if you want an explanation of this, or you need an explanation of this, there's one at the back of the book. So at the end, they can sort of read why this works, why it made sense. Because I personally laid out awake at night till 2 a.m. trying to figure out this resolution, this time travel twist, and it works in my world in the way that
So
it's
like
set up.
adding a footnote, that's a good idea.
Yeah, just put a little footnote. I'm like, if you're just enjoying the story, you just keep on reading and don't worry about it. But if you're one of those people that's like, wait a minute, I need to like unravel this time travel knot, then they could just read to the end or skip to the end and read it. Or when they get to the end, they'd be satisfied. I feel like that's going to maybe save me some confused reviews just because they got to the end and be like, oh, okay, here's just in plain English what happened. And then that's my theory anyway. So far, so good. All my readers so far have enjoyed the book.
I think the readers like me would be easiest. So they're just like, I don't care that this donut on another planet probably shouldn't take Kirk, Spock, and McCoy back to older. I'm just along for the ride. The donut's cool. It works for me.
And I think that's one of the things that there have been enough time travel films and stories out there that people aren't unfamiliar with these tropes. And people will give you a pass somewhat on because it's not new to them. Like Star Trek has done it. Everyone has done time travel. The Simpsons has done time travel. So we're not completely new to it.
It does help when you're kind of writing in a familiar space of sci-fi that most of your readers are probably going to grasp.
Yeah.
Well, we've been talking about sci-fi here. Do you want to mention your new series? Did you have any challenges? Like you kind of the time travel guy now, and now you're doing something with airships and more a little steampunky. Was it any challenge to get your readers to follow you over?
It is. It's a little bit tougher. Not as many made the leap as I had thought would. The Skylighter Adventures is a story that it was the very first story I wanted to write before I ever wrote time travel. And the world was just a little bit too big for me to handle. I wasn't ready for it as an author. So I waited, and I'm glad that I did. And I'm very proud of the book. It's probably some of my best work as far as world building. But it's science fiction. It takes place on a different planet, but it's basically like there the sky is very similar to the ocean, where there's a lot of stuff living in it. And plants, animals, and people. The native population, the Skylighters of the Skylighter Adventures series, are people that live in the sky. And then there's some humans who have also come to sort of colonize the world, and they're interacting, and those humans are starting to learn to fly. So now there's this beginning of a conflict because the ground is a very unsafe place there. It's full of sinkholes and lightning sand and things that you don't want to be around on the ground, the dangerous animals and things like that. So everyone's trying to learn to fly, and now there's this sort of growing conflict, sort of a colonist versus native issue between who's going to own the sky. And it was a lot of fun. I wrote it with some young adult characters who I didn't set out to write a young adult book. I just set out to write an adventure story, and it happened to have YA characters. And I think I grew up in a time when YA wasn't really a thing. I just read adventure books as a kid, and Treasure Island, it never would have occurred to me to call Treasure Island a young adult book, but technically it is. So, but I just wrote an adventure story that I wanted to read, and many of my readers have made the leap over there because it is science fiction and it is adventure, which is what I write. But yeah, the diehard time travel people, probably won't make that leap over there, or people who just now see sort of the label of YA and think, oh, I don't read YA, without really thinking this is just an adventure story, and I would probably like it because the people that do try it, the reviews have been excellent. It's probably, like I said, it's some of my best work. So I think if the people did try it, they'd probably get on board with the fact that it's just young characters.
Yeah, YA is a weird thing like that, where it's like YA is one of the subgenre and twists on a genre where it's defined by the things that aren't in it mostly. Like, well, it doesn't have these three things you don't want your kids reading about, therefore it's YA. And immediately, for some reason, that turns off half of the audience.
Right.
All right, but back to time travel. Actually, first off, I'm gonna have a hard time not completely talking about where your and my ideas intersect, because there are quite a few places. Okay. But for example, you now have multiple series, and at least one of your series, allows for multiple worlds to exist and for you to transit between them. And you mentioned earlier about sort of having similar elements occurring in both. Whenever I do that, and I do it frequently, I eventually hide some Easter eggs to suggest that there may be some crossover. Is that anything that you do?
I do. And interestingly enough, the Skylighter Adventures is technically a spin-off of In Times Like These.
Excellent.
There is one character who's actually an AI that crosses over that exists in both stories. And I thought that would be a stronger connection for readers to be like, oh, this is actually technically a spin-off of In Times Like These. But it hasn't really been the case. I don't think a single person has mentioned it to me. Oh yeah, by the way, thanks for adding this character, because I think they just enjoyed the story for what it is and don't really care that it's a spin-off.
Yeah, it's funny how that works. It's I mean, that's not even an Easter egg. Like that's an an established element. But when you take the time to hide something, sometimes you get upset when people don't find it.
No one notices. Yeah.
And the other thing I want to ask is, again, just where my ideas and yours intersect. You got time travel. Obviously, in a multiverse situation, this would happen less frequently. But have you ever run into a situation where you had a future event influence the current events of the book, and then realize that you have to now write that future event as part of canon? Because that's a thing that could occur, where in order for this timeline to reach that point, this event has to have happened in that timeline, and you get this weird flow chart you got to make a video about on YouTube later.
Yeah, that is the fun of time travel, is trying to plan it out in advance. I typically only get the idea for the next book about halfway through the book I'm writing. So that can be challenging. I didn't plan out all 4 books of the series in advance. I was just kind of doing it piecemeal. But there were ideas that I set up in book 1 that ended up being this main plot of book 3, for example. But it was just a matter of mining your own books for material and making something work that you may have alluded to. And I did have, in the beginning, I think, starting out, when you have an idea for a book, and especially if it's your first book, you have tons of ideas. You want to cram everything into this one book. And because you don't know if you're going to write another one. This is your first novel. You don't know what you're doing. So I set a lot of things up. And then I think the second book I did even more, because it's a huge book. It was a long 200,000 word novel. And I set up a ton. So it gave me plenty of material to then go and expand on later. And then people will send me messages like, how did you think of this so far in advance? Like, did you have this all plotted out? And the answer is no. I just had these ideas that I thought were cool, and then went back and fleshed them out.
All right. Going off of Joe's question, I've often wondered about creating a crossover amongst multiple series, like having someone from series 1 slipping and falling into the mother of all portals and pop it up in series 2.
Yeah.
With the worlds you've created, following the rules you've set in places, would you ever consider doing something like that? Because it kind of sounds like you have or are or in the process of.
I was very big when I started out that I was going to start writing a book that was going to open a door that then would open up 100 other doors. So technically, almost when you have time travel as a gimmick, almost anything becomes possible. It's like having magic in a fantasy world. Like, if with magic, you can do darn near anything. Whereas with time travel, it's very similar, because you've got all of the future, you've got all of the past, and you've got all these alternate timelines. You could throw in aliens, you could throw in whatever you want. If time travel is possible, then there are very few things that become impossible. So I think that's one of the best parts of the genre. And if you're writing it into I think there's been videos and clips of like how, because Hermione had a time turner, she could have solved all these different problems in Harry Potter and taken out Voldemort single-handedly, probably, with that time turner. But it's such a powerful tool that you have to sort of write your own rules around it to limit your characters. I think that's becomes one of the biggest challenges of time travel, is finding limitations. For example, early on in my books, they can only time travel about 5 years at a time with their devices, and you have to fix it so that they can't just do everything. And that's part of the fun of building the world.
So, any words of wisdom for authors contemplating, and if they have more than one series, doing something like that? Things to be on the lookout for, things not to do.
As far as crossover? I would say keep the fans you have happy first. I would say, before you start expecting them to make the leap into a new series, make sure that you're satisfying everyone with their current needs, because they signed on for a reason. They signed on to one particular series because they like these characters and the settings, and whatever you're doing in one series is you're doing something right. So I would say that you just be careful trying to shunt all those people into a new series that may be a different trope or a different genre that they didn't sign on for. So now they like these characters, and maybe they like you and the way you write, but it's almost like you don't own the characters at a certain point, where the readers, they almost belong to the readers. And I would just be cautious of taking them in a direction that's too far different from what your reader signed on for. I'd be curious though, if you try it, let me know how it goes.
Will do.
All right. Speaking of new directions, I guess we should get into some of the marketing stuff you've been doing. It looks like you recently released a new book in Times Like These series. What does a launch look like for you these days?
So yeah, I've been trying a few new things. For me, launches are big because, like I said, I only release really one novel a year. I'm full-time self-employed, but I've got a lot of things going on job-wise, so I have limited time and resources for the author business. So that's about what's been working out. And also, as I said, I write fairly long books. So when I do launch, it has to carry me for a while. I wish that I could be releasing a book every month or every couple months. It's just not realistic for me. So I rely heavily on, because they're big books, I'm all in KU, which just makes sense financially for my books. It's just easy, because it's kind of a no-brainer. They just make so much more money from a borrow than they even do from a sale. So I focus on that. What my most recent launch was heavily discounting all the other books in the series. As I started, I did not notify my list in advance. I don't do pre-orders typically, or I do as very short of a pre-order as possible, like just a couple days, just so I have a specific date to launch on. And then I will have the print book up at the same time, usually, but I don't tell anybody right away. And what I did recently was I launched to my beta team first. I have a really large beta reader team. I used to have as many as 400 people, but I've whittled it down a little bit more to 100 and some odd now. And I think the last round had maybe 80 people download ARCs for the last. I've done something unusual because of the fact that I do release so infrequently. I've been actually giving my readers, and I think you might be trying something similar to this, Lindsay, if I'm not mistaken, but I've actually been giving people chapters as I write them, as my beta team has been sort of reading along as I write the book, which has been a great way to keep them engaged. I've got a private group for them to read things in. They share a Google Doc, and they give me edits and comments as I go. And that's been really great for engagement and really getting a lot of anticipation. And I also ended up writing a bonus chapter. I try to steal a page from the romance author book, and I know it's very big for them to have extended epilogues, things like that at the end of the book. So I did bonus chapter just for my beta readers, essentially, because they'd already read the rest of the book. So, but they got their names in the book, and when they bought it on day one, they could also get an extra chapter with deleted scenes and things like that in it. So I launched first to my beta team, and that was great for getting reviews. So I was able to get 20 or 30 reviews right out of the gate. And then I launched my mailing list after that. And then after that, I've always done Facebook launch parties, which I know are, they were real popular a few years ago, and probably less popular these days. They're not huge for moving sales, but they've been wonderful for me for reader engagement. So I kind of go big on those, not, like I said, not because of sales necessarily, but just for an opportunity to really connect. I have a pretty big presence over in the UK and Europe, and a lot of readers that are really dedicated over there. So I wanted to make sure that I had a way to reach them. So I ended up throwing this 9-hour launch party last week. So, but I had a lot of guest authors and videos and tons of prizes and giveaways. I usually give away a Kindle and an Amazon gift card and all kinds of stuff. So I hype them up pretty big. And like I said, I did run promos. I ran the first book of the series free for a while. There were 99-cent deals on books 2 and 3. I have a novella that I gave away for free. So it was in KU, it makes sense to go big all at one time. So that's what that week looked like, and I'm still seeing the results now. This week's sales have been really good because of the fact that it had such of a big splash all at once.
It sort of links me to my question. Like now, once you do a launch, how closely do you monitor the performance of the book during the first few weeks after the launch?
I'm paying attention. Obviously, I'm doing a lot more with AMS ads than I used to, so I'm heavily in on those. There's not a lot else to do though. After you've made this big splash, you usually see a pretty good halo off the back end. The tail on it is takes care of itself for a little bit. It's more maybe the next 90 after I get past the 90 days with Amazon where they're promoting you, then I just have to start thinking about creative ways to get the sales numbers back up. Usually I'll have a really good first month after a launch, and then it slowly starts going down, but it'll definitely level off at a higher level of daily sales than it was. Every time I put out a new book, obviously your sort of daily sales can go up, which is good.
Okay, so you mentioned you use the Amazon ads. Have you ever tried using any of the Facebook ads?
I have, and I have not really been very successful with Facebook. I certainly give it a good shot. I used some during the launch this time, but Facebook has been wonderful at taking all of my money and charging me $1 a click for stuff. So it's not something that I've tested enough and cracked well enough to employ with any kind of real success budget-wise, whereas AMS is something that I've been able to play with and actually get good return on investment. Especially being in KU, you get a much bigger return. And like I said, because I write these big books that make me more money off of borrows than they do off of sales, that it just makes sense for me to use AMS as much as possible.
Have you tried anything with BookBub?
I have. They have not been big on giving a lot of featured deals to people that are all in KU of late. Quite a few authors I've talked to who are also all in KU have sort of almost dried up. The odds of getting a BookBub feature deal is pretty slim, but the BookBub ads I do use. And one of the difficulties of time travel is finding other authors to target who are similar, because time travel is such a diverse group of books. You might find another author on the time travel charts that's doing well, but their book is completely different from yours. So trying to associate yourself with another author can be very challenging, and then finding that author on BookBub or on Facebook, it's even more. I think it's more difficult on Facebook. I think one of the reasons why I struggle to succeed there, whereas if you're Mark Dawson, you can just say, okay, well, I'm going to target Lee Child, and it's a fairly decent crossover where you're just, okay, people who like these books will like these books. I don't have that person. I don't look out there and say, oh yeah, if you like so-and-so. I think the closest I come is maybe Jodi Taylor, who's a UK author who writes quirky time travel, but it's different. It's still very different from what I write. So if you don't write something that's similar to what someone else writes, it's very hard to target them and target their fans. So it takes a lot of practice.
That's exactly what I was thinking when you said Facebook ads were tough, because I've had the same experience where there aren't, because they only have the big name authors in there. You can't target somebody on Amazon that's an indie author that just happens to be selling well that week.
Yeah.
Kind of in your field. And I kind of had the same experience with, I don't really write epic fantasy. I kind of write these fun secondary world fantasy, but it's more like in the style of a lot of urban fantasy. But a lot of urban fantasy people aren't interested in the secondary world fantasy. So I think that's been my struggle too with the Facebook ads, is like finding authors that I feel I'm similar to, and that if people buy the books, they'll like them.
And I think that's an important distinction for people who are trying Facebook ads out to understand, is that it's not just you. You're probably not doing it wrong. I mean, if you're following an ads course and someone else is doing something and they're just making tons of money on Facebook ads, there are a lot of little factors like that change the success of different. And it's almost a case by case basis where you have to look at what works, what kind of advertising works well for your books and your audience, and then just go big on that, because you can't just duplicate everyone else's success and have the same results.
Right, and I've found too the Amazon ads right now are working a little better for me, and you can target the person that just happens to be selling well that week in the time travel category, so that's nice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I
Is
think,
there any?
yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I'm saying, it's much more based on the quality of your own cover and blurb and your copy. People are already on Amazon buying books, which is great. So it's much more down to which book. And if they're already looking at other time travel books, it's which time travel book do I want? And your odds of success there are much better.
Definitely, and if you just can outcompete all the other 100 books that are competing for that same author at this particular time.
Yeah.
Have you tried anything else to keep the sales going throughout the year when, you know, we've talked about before how if you release often, it's easier to keep the momentum going. But when you're on a once-a-year schedule, which is honestly a lot more realistic for most people, it can be a challenge not to just see sales completely drop off. Are you doing anything else besides the Amazon ads?
Yes, I do a fair amount of promos. I definitely, if you're in KU, it makes sense to use free days. It makes sense to use Kindle Countdown deals. I think definitely take advantage of them. I was a big proponent of perma-free for a long time. Book one in times like these was free for a very long time, years. I gave away probably 250,000 copies of that at least, and which was great because it was wonderful for reviews. The reviews just poured in, and that was just as I was starting out as a new author, people really needed a way in. So that I highly recommend perma-free, and I know people sometimes come down on it and aren't as excited about it, and it's tough, especially as a new author. You're thinking, man, I just wrote this book. Why would I want to give it away for free? But if you're new and if you're struggling, then do it. I plan to do that probably once I have more books out in my Skylighter series. I'm sure that book one will go free for a while, just to get it some legs, because you have to just dump people into that funnel somehow. If they're not coming in organically, if they're not coming in any other way, then just run it free for a while and just get readers, because I think a series needs readers far more than it needs sales initially. Because the more books in the series, obviously, you have, the more of a return on investment you're going to get for that. So I'm big on perma-free. I'm big on using free giveaways as often as possible. And then I do use some ad stacking techniques if you're going to use Robin Reads or bargain book scene, things like that. But you can only hit them so many times before you start to get a diminishing return. So it's tough. The one thing I did this year, which I hadn't done previously, was I did release a little novella. I hammered out a novella in a week or two and then put that up in January, and it was great for sales. People were just starving for something else in the series, and it had been a while because I had written the Skylighter Adventures book last year. It had been a while since I put any time travel out, and it was a great way to sort of test the waters. And like, well, how's the demand right now for my next novel? And people snatched it up, and I was selling it. Initially, I was thinking, man, this is I put it down to 99 cents just recently, just this week for the launch. But I was selling it at $2.99, and it was only an hour or so read. I think it's only 70 pages or something, but people were buying it at $2.99. So I said, well, that's interesting. So it definitely paid for itself really quickly. It was a great piece of content to put out. So if I can come up with more stories that are in my world that are spin-off characters or whatever, I highly recommend that. It was just, for me, I had never thought of a story that I could write that was that short before. So I struggled to not write a story that wasn't 150,000 words.
Yeah, I can commiserate with that.
Yeah. There's definitely benefits to long books. I mean, Audible has been great. If you're trying to kickstart your audio sales, another thing perma-free is great for is if your first in series is perma-free and it's whisper synced, then that's a great way to start your readers off on your audiobooks. And then if you have a good narrator, then they'll just churn right through the rest of your audio. And long books, of course, look great for a credit. So that's good advice.
Yep. We'll probably be talking about audiobooks a little bit more later, but you mentioned earlier that you don't really plan your series too far in advance. Like halfway through this book, you're figuring out what the next book is going to be. do you ever let the performance of the last book, or now that you've got more than one series, do you ever sort of look at the comparative performance and let that guide the direction that your next release is going to be, whether it's in one series or another, or maybe how long or short it'll be, or any of the other features of the book?
Yes, I think I did that with this past book. After the launch of Faster Than Falling, which is the first book in my Scholar series, I put a ton of effort into that book. I mean, it probably cost me $10,000 by the time I was done with all the audio, and I put a lot of money into custom maps and illustrated design, which I ended up changing later. You spend a lot of money on custom illustration and things like that. But it just didn't launch as well as I had wanted, and it didn't make the money that I had hoped, considering how much work I had put into it. So I did turn around and say, okay, well, everyone's said this is great, but we want more time travel. Because that was what my list was. That's what my readers wanted. So I said, okay, I will write another time travel book. And that's, to this day, I mean, it's still where all the money is for me. That's what earns all the money that funds whatever else I want to write. So I think it is realistic that if you have a sort of flagship series, I know we talked about this at the conference Lindsay and I were at, talked about the idea of a flagship series and what it is that's driving the ship, and for me, that's time travel. So no matter what else I want to write, I'm probably still going to want to keep putting out time travel books because it's paying the bills. It's keeping everything else afloat until something else just takes off, in which case, they don't have more options. But it's definitely a factor.
So I was going to ask you, is there a point in which you feel it would be best to stop releasing titles for an underperforming series and maybe focus on something new?
I'm dealing with that right now because I do have 2 more books planned in my Scholar series, and I think I feel very strongly that it will take off. Like I said, I may have to run one free for a while, and I think there are ways you can get a series going and get it some legs under it. Perma-free being probably one of the best tools. But yeah, if I don't see it doing anything after book 3, then I would probably stop. I would say, I'd give it a chance, and if it's just something that I don't find a market for, it obviously pays to write to market if you can write that way. But
Not many people do.
Not many people do, because it's a work of love. It's passion. You've got to be excited about the story. And I write terribly under other people's deadlines, or if someone's inviting me to be in some other Kindle world or something and they want a story for that, that's the last thing I want to do, because my time is precious. My creative outlets, I want to use them on the things that I'm in love with. And if that doesn't happen to be something that's super marketable, I still want to write it. Because at the end of the day, I'm fortunate in that like I said, I'm self-employed on multiple fronts. It doesn't have to pay all my bills. If you're a full-time writer and you do rely completely on your income, it's probably a little bit of a different story. You may have to cut things off a little quicker. But if you're fortunate enough to have multiple streams of income, then write what you love.
And that was the second part of my question, is how many titles should be released in a series before it should be abandoned and move on to something else?
My first book, when I first launched it, it was, I had a Facebook launch party, which I've always done. And I had a pretty good presence on Facebook, and I always have. It's kind of the platform where I hang out. And got a really good return on it. I mean, all my friends and family, of course, bought it, which is the worst thing these days. For your also bots, it's actually the opposite of what you want. But it shot right up the charts right away, and I thought, this is amazing. I've got this book, and it's in the top 800 or whatever for my first book. I thought, this is great, and it was excellent. But then right after that, of course, it just went nowhere, because I had sold it to everyone I know, and then that was it. I didn't know anyone else. So if the common denominator is just that they like you, then that's all you can do. But once I started figuring out how to actually market, how to really sell books, then it was book 2, and book 3 was really where things took off for me. So I wouldn't cut anything short before book 3, just based on my personal experience of knowing how long it took to get my series to the point where I would call it really successful. And I think book 3 was that point for me. It was, and I've heard people say that, oh no, it was book 5 for me where things really took off. So I would caution people to not give up on a series too early. If you know it's good, if the reviews are good, I think that's the key. If the readers who are finding it are liking it, then trust your gut and keep writing, and then find a way to market it later once you have more books, because you can't do much with one book. can't do much with 2 books. Like for a while, I was giving away book 1 for free just to get people into book 2. That's all I had. I only had 2 books, and one of them was free. So, but I did it because I knew that those people were eventually going to be reading books 3 and 4 or whatever else I would write. And it paid off. The patience paid off. So I wouldn't give up too soon.
I think that's especially true if it's your first series that you're doing as an author, because most people aren't going to really know what they're doing, know what works as far as marketing that book 1 goes. They don't have a platform yet. They don't have any fans. So it's hard to judge, like, just because it didn't become a KU all-star, with your very first book doesn't mean it can't take off later. And I do agree with you with the perma-free, or at least free for a while book 1 can be great when you're writing something that's not to market and that's maybe a little out there. People may love it, but they may not be willing to risk $5 to find out, but they're like, oh, it's free, we'll see. And I feel like I've gotten a lot of my readers that way, just with the free book 1s in the longer series. And yeah, if you're going to write lots of books, then it can make sense to give that first one away.
Yeah, all I have to do is go back through and read some of my reviews on book 3, and some of them will say, well, I happened to find the first book of this series for free one day, and I thought I'd give it a chance. And then here they are on book 3 or 4. So I've gotten a lot of my readers that way, so it definitely shouldn't be discounted.
Right, and even if you're going to do KU, you can still make book 1 free everywhere and have it be perma-free there. It's just, you might not want to do a cliffhanger ending, or all the Kobo people are going to be, coming after you with pitchforks. But if it's a complete story, they may still be frustrated, but they may be willing to check it out on Amazon. Or you could always figure other ways, like have an ARC team or something where they can get review copies and post reviews on Goodreads or something.
Absolutely.
But I noticed you've got a book 1 through 3 box set. Is that just for the convenience of the readers, or do you use that for marketing purposes too?
I use it for marketing purposes as well. And I'm actually planning to make another box set with books 1 through 4 plus the novella. It'll be like the mega box set, because it just makes sense. If you can get somebody to bite in one fell swoop, like I said, especially with KU, that's something like, I want to say 2,700 words all together. I think it's pretty close to the limit of the 3,000 words, what you get paid for anyway. So I think, like, if that box set, if someone buys it, I want to say I only make like, $5, but if they borrow it, I make close to $13. So it makes sense. And you have to look at your own books, though. If it works for you in KU, if you're in KU, if you're not in KU, it might be a different story. So you have to just do what makes sense for you. But I like having a box set just because it gives you another product on your page. It gives you another thing that you can offer up to BookBub every once in a while, just because you can only throw something at them every 4 weeks. So, more products to offer. Sometimes maybe they'll bite on the box set when they wouldn't bite on the individual book. So I'm all for just having as many different products out and available as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And as promised, since we're getting close to the end, I do have a question about audiobooks. Okay. You mentioned like all in doing a production and it costing you close to $10,000, and having written a very long book and having self-produced it. It sounds like you self-produced your book as opposed to doing the revenue split. So how much effort did you put into selecting a narrator, and do you think that has a substantial impact on the performance of a book?
Absolutely, it does. I think that it's probably one of the most important decisions you can make. And I think that money spent on a good narrator is, the best money you can spend. As far as if you're going to go through the effort of producing an audiobook, don't skimp on it, because it needs to be a pleasure to listen to. And I was very fortunate early on that I was able to find a good narrator for my In Times Like These series, and I did do a royalty split with him after I made an unusual decision where I started with book 2, because the Chronothon was a very different story, and I thought it had more potential, like more commercial appeal across the board. And you can read it as a standalone. You don't have to have read book 1 to read it, though most people do. So I made the unusual decision of starting with producing the audiobook for book 2 without doing the one for book 1, which was a mistake. I don't recommend doing that, because I got one irate Audible listener who was like, I can't find book 1, and then gave me a negative review, and then that, of course, review stuck around forever. But even though the other books are up, But I ended up going back and doing royalty share on the first one. My logic at the time, because book one was a perma-free, I thought, well, if people can get the Kindle book for free, why would they want to spend money on the audiobook, which was the absolute wrong idea. The right answer is, hey, I got this ebook for free. Now I can get a discount on the audiobook. So that they're saying yes and yes. They're not saying I only want one, because many people want both. They want the ebook and they want the audiobook. It's not a one or the other type audience, which that was my mistake. I thought that if you had one, you wouldn't pay money for the other, just because maybe I'm cheap and that's the way I think. But that's not how readers think. So I think if you have a book one that is a perma-free, definitely make an audiobook out of it, because that's going to be your best seller, because it's whisper synced, especially. And if people are constantly getting that download, if you're getting hundreds of downloads a day of that freebie, that's hundreds of people who are getting that extra little add-on afterwards. Hey, do you want to add on the audiobook for $7 or whatever it is your audiobook costs to add on? So go for it. That's where you're going to kickstart your audio series and really get people into it. And then, of course, like you said, having a good narrator, I think, is essential to people sticking around, because not only do they have to like your story, but they have to like the experience of hearing your story. And if you don't want to listen to them, then they won't either. So make sure, yeah, I've been very fortunate and found very, very talented actors who are great with voices, and I love all of my audiobooks.
So, like any fantasy sci-fi author, you more than likely have made up names that would give an audiobook narrator a headache. So how much do you stress on the narrator pronouncing every word correctly in your mind's eye?
I think early on, for example, when I was trying out my first narrator, I had a couple different auditions that were really good. And one was who was an excellent, very talented voice actor. And you could tell that he could do all kinds of different accents, but he naturally took all the characters completely different directions than what I had written them. Like, a guy who was supposed to be a grandfather, sounded like a street thug. So it was talented. It was great that he could do such a great street thug voice, but it wasn't what I was going for. So I knew that if I were to pick him, I would have to coach every single voice and think, man, I'm going to need a sample of every single one of these people before I ever produce this book. Whereas another narrator who was also excellent just sort of naturally took them the way that I had written them. He got the way I was writing the characters on the page, and he naturally translated them. And I knew that I wasn't going to have to be that picky. So I think it's a matter of finding the person who gets what you're trying to say. And I was fortunate enough with my time travel series to find my actor or narrator, Neil Helligers. He also really liked time travel. He actually came and pitched me, even though he was in a higher price bracket than what I was initially going for. He offered to do the book just because he liked time travel stories. And he was doing book two, but he went ahead and read book one anyway, just for the heck of it, just so he would understand the characters better. And that's the kind of narrator that you really want. You want someone who's going to commit to their role. And I was very impressed with that. And then when it came time to do Skylight Adventure series, I actually went out and found someone whose voice I really liked in advance, and then went and pitched them the idea, and then found them, off of ACX first, and said, hey, I'm in love with this voice of yours. Would you do my audio? What do you charge? And then she just came back with a price, and I said, yep, sure, absolutely, let's do it. So there's different ways to approach it, but you definitely want to get that right.
It seems like since you have such long books, it might be kind of a hard decision if you're paying up front.
Yeah.
If you want to make the investment. I know I'm paying for one of my old backlist series gradually here. But at the same time, we've definitely talked about before how people will see a long audiobook and think it's a really good deal, and they've got their credit to spend. And so have you done anything specific to market your audiobooks that you think has actually worked? It's always something we're trying to figure out how to sell more of those.
Yeah. Like I said previously, I think the perma-free was the number one biggest thing to get them moving. And that obviously works best if it's a series, because you can make the money back on the tail end. I think that I have tried specifically targeting, audio keywords for, obviously, on Facebook or in AMS ads. I've deliberately gone after audiobook listeners in my targeting. And I think that has had some good results. But a lot of it is organic. And like I said, you can't do a lot of price promotion, unfortunately, in audio. So the best way to do it is to market the ebook as best you can and just hope for those add-on sales. So the more freebie days that you're running on the ebook version, the more people are getting offered that add-on page, that WhisperSync. Make sure that obviously that your audio is good enough that it matches with WhisperSync and gets that offer, because you don't want to have that be different and have it not work. But so I think all the things that you do for your ebooks, will ultimately help your audio. So that's the best advice I have, really. It's not, there's not a magic bullet for audio by any means, but just visibility for that ebook as best you can.
I agree. I've had the same experience where I've got a box set where the audiobook is actually the whole 3 books, so they end up being a long one. And every time I run that box set, it's like the first 3 in an 8-book series. I get a BookBub or something and able to move a whole lot of copies. I'll see in a publisher's report like, oh wow, that audiobook really performed well this quarter. So
yeah, absolutely. A BookBub, if you can get one. Yeah, that's why I'm never afraid to run a free BookBub if I can get one. Like, because a lot of times that people are like, oh, I really want the 99¢, or I want to make some money with this, but I'm never afraid to run a free one, just because I know that I'm still going to make money off the audio. Like, if I might get thousands of downloads of the free ebook, but I'm also going to sell 600 audio books, so it's definitely worth it.
Definitely. And the free ebooks or BookBubs are cheaper than the paid ones too. So there's that. Yeah. Do you have anything else you'd like any tips for aspiring time travel authors, or just anybody working in maybe a smaller niche before we close up?
I think that these days, especially, it's very important to develop your readership with personal ways as best you can. I know that I've had a lot of success, especially because I write so infrequently. Like I said, I'm only publishing a book a year. It becomes essential that you develop relationships with your readers. So I have a private Facebook groups for my readers. I have, like I said, I have a very involved beta team who's like reading stuff as I go. I've got, I let them talk to each other a lot. Like, they have a shared editing forum where like they're all leaving comments about the stuff in the same place, so they get to converse with each other. The more ways that you can develop those personal relationships, the more word of mouth you're developing. And there's never a way to quantify that level of marketing, but it is still the most powerful. Just having people on your team who are as excited about your book as you can get them to be. It's such a powerful marketing tool, and it's just fun too. It's a lot of friendships that you build, and you get these amazing emails and interactions with people. So I think try to, when in doubt, focus on those relationships and build them as much as you can, and I think the results will show down the road.
Yeah, it's hard to quantify word of mouth advertising, but I know that I've definitely had a lot of people say like, oh, I always recommend your books, and I got this person reading them, and it's a good feeling and useful for keeping things selling between releases. Or like, if you're like me and you jump to a different genre and don't have a new release in that for a year or more, definitely. But let people know where they can find you online, and maybe which of your book ones they should check out, or both. Absolutely,
yeah. My name is Nathan Van Coops. Van Coops is VANCOOPS. It's 2 words. I'm the only one there is, so I'm really easy to find. NathanVanCoops.com if you want to try out a couple of free stories for me. You can find me on Facebook. I have a group called The Tempest Fugitives, which is a great place to just hang out and chat about time travel. You don't have to have read my books to hang out there, but if you're a time travel fan and you want to just come chat, I'm also in the time travel group on Goodreads. And of course, my newsletter is where all the real fun action is. So if you want to come, check me out at nathanvancoops.com and get all the fun stuff there. That's always great too.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us on the show today, and thanks for listening, everyone. This has been episode 189. We're getting up there.
All right. Well, thanks so much for having me.
All right. Thanks for hanging out with us, Nathan. Nice to meet you, sir.
Guys.
So long, everybody.